Bonjour, bienvenue, welcome everyone. On behalf of the Arts Consultants Canada, l'Association des Consultants Canadiens en Art, my name is Victoria Steele, and I'm chair of the Volunteer Board of Directors. We are delighted to see such great interest in this topic. It's very interesting how many of us have learned to adapt to digital tools, but have yet to figure out how to master it and where the heck do we start? There's just so much choice. So I want to thank the Canada Council for the Arts, who's supported this series, six-part series of workshops, as well as our podcast series. So thank you, Canada Council. And we're calling this Digital Tools for the 21st Century Consultant. But we all have slightly different approaches of the work that we do with our clients. So it'll be fun to see how we've approached this. We are absolutely delighted to be working with Lacey Alana on this. She's going to lead us through this for the next 6 Thursdays. And just so some of you know, there's some of the more open-ended ones towards the end. So if we want to dig deeper into some of the topics, she's going to help us do that. This is going to be in English. Mais pour ceux qui parlent français, Lacey comprend le français. But for technical things, it might be better in English. Okay? J'espère que ça va marcher pour tout le monde. I just want to say that I am coming to you today from the Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, otherwise known as Ottawa-Gatineau, and I too am not in the woods. The association wants to acknowledge that we and our members work on the traditional territory of First Nation, Inuit, Métis people from coast to coast to coast. And their presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We acknowledge the historical oppression of their lands and cultures and what we know as Canada, and fervently believe that the arts contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey that we are all on together. So we honor their long history of welcoming many other peoples to this beautiful territory and are so grateful to have the opportunity to work here. Enough from me, over to Lacey to kick us off and introduce herself. Merci. Over to you, Lacey.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great. So yeah, let's dive right in. Thank you for doing the introductions. And I'll note at the top a couple of things. If there are any access needs that would benefit from shifts, changes, support, whatnot, feel free to message me, message the group. It can be a direct message. Also, Victoria, who just spoke, can send a private message if there's anything that you need. We're happy to assist with that. And I will be giving you a lot of information, but please feel free to ask questions. You can use the chat box, you can unmute and use whatever format works better for you. And yeah, from there, we'll dive right in. I'm going to lay out a little bit up top. I'll spend some time in kind of PowerPoint mode, more didactic teaching, and then we'll do some things that may be conversational depending on how much time we have. But do feel free to ask questions anytime. So to kind of orient you just to who I am, I kind of work across several different domains. I'm a trainer and I'm a consultant to do a lot of work in the nonprofit world, in arts organizations, and also corporations, training on kind of a wide range of things, which I'll cover a little bit more in a moment. I'm also a multidisciplinary artist doing work in the circus field, in theater, and in specialized arts programming. So I run some specialized improv theater programming for autistic youth. I run some circus programming for autistic youth, etc. And then I'm actually also a psychotherapist and specialize in relational neurobiology. So understanding kind of the nervous system and what's going on with that as we're moving through the world. And so I blend all of these pieces together. And part of what happened for me is during the pandemic time when everything moved online, I was doing a lot of online and kind of virtual work prior. And then that sort of further progressed this digital world exploration and knowledge and teaching for other folks who are trying to figure out how to navigate this space. And so with this, kind of where we're going, as Victoria had noted, when we think about the digital realm, there are so many apps and tools and sites and everything that could be potentially covered, right? And any one of those could be covered and pulled apart in a 6-part series. And so part of, as I was thinking about this, of, okay, we only have six 6 weeks and 6 hours, I was thinking about the reality that this landscape is going to really continue to change. And so, how can we develop and explore not only the creation and competence with specific tools and understanding them more in depth, but how can we approach our use of digital tools, the way that we're interacting with them, develop our sort of literacy around navigating how do I even pick the right tools and how do I create kind of an iterative practice of evaluating and reflecting how the tools I'm using right now are working, what changes or shifts might be needed or benefiting, and how to move outside of this. And so overall in this series of training, we kind of start wide and funnel in a little bit to more specifics. And so, yeah, today we're going to start with some of the common pitfalls and get us sort of thinking about this from the theoretical framework as we move inward towards some more specific concrete skills. And as Victoria mentioned, we have 2 trainings at the end that are totally open topic wise. Those will evolve and go wherever it is that you all want it to go. So diving into this, uh, as you know, there's so many tools and so many promises, right? With all the digital tools available, we can collaborate more easily, we can communicate better, create easeful organization systems, simplify our scheduling, enhance productivity, right? All of these different things. And despite this, I'm guessing, has everyone had just fantastic, easygoing digital tools experiences? Everybody feeling perfectly productive, connected, communicating well, all of the yeah. I appreciate the laughing cry smiley face, Diane. Yes. Yes. No. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And this is exactly kind of where I think so much of what we do uh in the work world in general, there are these gaps between what we know or think should be happening, or even skills that we have when we have them versus how it's actually going. And even if we know, like, oh, well, I want my relationship with digital tools to be excellent and I want to like figure out how to do that, that doesn't inherently mean that it's happening, right? Um, yeah. And so thinking through, like, all right, what does this mean? This is a fundamental reality. There are tons of these tools, tons of promises, and yet this isn't always happening. A lot of us are using a lot of tools, especially if you're doing consulting work. Some of them you may have picked for yourself and the work that you do, and some of them you may not have picked, and you're using them because the organization or organizations that you're working with use them. And you may have quite a collection of those amassing. And so we're often, toggling between. And the other part of this that I think, because I also come from this sort of nervous system therapeutic background, I'm always thinking about, like, yeah, what is going on in the ways that we're interacting with tools and not just the tools themselves. And a significant portion of the ways that we engage with the tools that we do is on autopilot. And ultimately, this is by design, right? In our brain does this in all sorts of areas of our life, because if we had to actively, intentionally think about every single thing that we do, every single choice that we make, we wouldn't actually be all that productive. And so our brain is designed to kind of create shortcuts to just go along with the thing that is happening or supposed to be happening, right? And so what this means is that often in sort of this digital landscape, we can sometimes just slide into and be kind of going with the flow with tools that other folks may be using. But it also means that we often, with all sorts of things that we do in life, transition from awareness and intentional choice and engagement to passive actions that we're not actually thinking about. And so, for example, and you may identify with this, if you think about the first time perhaps that you downloaded social media, maybe you downloaded Facebook or Instagram or whatever, when you did that, there was probably an intentional choice of like, oh, I've been hearing about this. I'm going to download this and make an account and whatever. And maybe initially you're like, oh yeah, I wonder if somebody posted something on Facebook. And there's some mindfulness with doing that because it wasn't just part of what you automatically already did. But with time, now, if you're anything like I am, you find yourself sometimes looking at your phone and you don't even know how it is that you got there, right? So you're doing this and it just is happening on autopilot. And so this same thing, even outside of the social networks and perhaps chosen fun tools and apps that we use. But the same thing happens with all of the different tools and resources that we engage with in our lives, right? So we intentionally maybe decide, oh, I'm going to use this tool to support our organization with communication. And perhaps it's a great choice, but often the intention that we're putting into that choice and creating it and engaging with it, eventually using that tool just becomes something that we do. And sometimes that's nice because we're not necessarily thinking about it, but it often means that we're not critically engaging with how we're actually using the tools that we're using and how well that's working. And we don't have as much of kind of an iterative evaluation cycle around assessing the relationship and the tools that we're using. Cool. If you have any questions, thoughts, feel free anytime to speak out or comment them. They're welcome. So kind of with this in mind is I like thinking about digital literacy as, in order to be sustainable, it has to be more than just navigating the tool, right? Of course, we want to know, okay, how do I specifically actually use this specific tool to be effective, to have success? But we also need to go beyond that, right? We want to understand and think about, like, okay, what are the tools that I'm using and how am I choosing those tools? And what are the ways I'm evaluating tools and creating that iterative follow through, which we'll talk more about? What are the ways that I am actually navigating the tool and using it? How am I implementing mindful digital strategy that really benefits from the tools versus just kind of, well, we're using them and it might be helpful? What are the ways that we're intentionally engaging with them? What are the ways that when we see a new tool or learn about something within a tool that we can kind of connect that into our work more broadly, et cetera, right? And so with these pieces, like this is kind of where we're starting today, like thinking about, like, okay, even as we're looking at in future trainings of, like, oh yeah, what are the things that I should specifically be asking and keeping in mind as I'm picking tools, and how do we potentially maximize various whiteboards and what's out there and what is the landscape of tools, which we'll get into. We want to be thinking about this kind of critical approach, not only of, like, what is the tool I should use, but like, how am I thinking about that? How am I figuring this out? So that in the future, as new tools continue to unfold, becomes more and more options and things available. You'll still be able to use these frameworks and apply them in the future, even for tools that are completely different. Cool. So that's some of where we're headed. A couple of things that I think are kind of interesting. A university in the Netherlands identified these kind of core digital competencies, starting with just like knowledge and functional skills. Can you use a device basically? And all the way to, how are we understanding the awareness of the role of tech in society, and how are we understanding the broader context of use and development? Also, I see there's some typos there. Such as life. You reread things and sometimes you still miss stuff. I will note too, from a note-taking perspective, and I don't know if ACCA has a structure to do this, but I am happy to share PowerPoints as well, so I can get that to y'all and y'all can get that to interested parties if that works for the ACCA folks, because that way, I know sometimes taking notes and things can be a lot. So that is something I'm happy to do. And yeah, so theory questions, just to lay these out, and then we're going to dive right in. Things to kind of keep in mind as we're thinking about this idea of theory. How are we thinking about the use of digital tools? How are we seeking digital tools? Why? What are the kind of broader frameworks for keeping in mind when we're doing this? What expectations and ideas do we have around how digital tool implementation or use is going to go? How are we actually interacting with the tools that we are already using? How do we create that intentional iterative evaluation system to evaluate, adapt tools in order to optimize? What frameworks are we working from, etc.? Cool. So I'm going to dive right into one of the pitfalls, number one, and then we'll pause and I'll see if folks have questions or thoughts, reflections. One of the reasons I like to think about kind of bringing some of these pitfalls in right away is that often there are things that you might relate to in the work that you're doing. And they invite some of these broader questions that give us some room to really think about how are we engaging with the tools and the tech that we're using? And what's the difference between a tool that is a great tool and a not great tool? And diving into those pieces. Cool. So, jumping right in, common pitfalls. So, number one, digital exhaustion and nonstop interruption. And I'll note this too before I start talking about this one. Some of the things that we're talking about will feel really familiar. You may be like, oh yes, yeah, I know this, I know this, I know this. And that's awesome. And I'll say that part of the reason that I like to cover these pieces or go into them is that it helps us close that gap between, okay, we have all these tools that are supposed to be really amazing and helping make life and work so much easier and better, but it's not actually playing out that way, and understanding this space between, right? And so it's the same idea where if I ask any organization in the world, hey, all of the employees there, what are the top 10 most important communication skills for good communication? Chances are good that the vast majority of people are going to list really similar skills, right? It should be really listening. You have to check for understanding. You maybe somebody says you make eye contact. Somebody says, body language, right? And everybody knows theoretically, okay, what are good communication skills? What makes someone easy to communicate with or not easy to communicate with? And yet, even though we all know those things, good communication is not necessarily happening, often isn't in every organization in the world that likely would agree on a lot of those same qualities, right? And it's the same with this, where it's like we can know what should be happening, but it doesn't mean it's happening. And in the process of making sense of this space in between, we have to kind of get critical about looking at the things that we know. And that's what this is about. Okay. So, things that are important in this domain of digital interruption and exhaustion is one, I already mentioned this piece of we develop these behavioral patterns and how we use the things that we use, right? So that example of the first time maybe you used Facebook, it was quite mindfully, and now you find yourself scrolling Facebook all the time. Similarly, I will find myself checking my email without having intentionally chosen to check my email. I was actually doing something else, and for some reason I clicked check my email, and now I'm in my email, right? Or because email is useful, then, oh, I'm starting my day, oh, I should check my email, right? So we develop these patterns and ways of being with the tools that we use, some of which we are aware of, some of which we may even recognize as a problem. Perhaps you are trying not to do those things, but often we have patterns that are playing out that we're not actually all that in touch with. And part of what we want to do in this process of figuring out how do I create the best digital plan for myself, for my organization that I can, we want to really understand what are the things that are happening right now and how can we truly see that as a part of this picture. Okay. Often, and I'm curious, I imagine this is true for many of you, we're doing a lot of rapid toggling between different apps, different tools, different messaging systems, and you may be switching and getting notifications. Maybe you've got Slack notes popping up, you've got emails that you're checking, you've got, your drives, you've got Teams, whatever it is that you have. There's often lots and lots of things coming into our space and into our work space. And again, some of them may be tools that you personally have picked for either you individually or perhaps an organization that you work for. And you probably also have tools that you didn't necessarily pick. And you may have both fun life tools and work related tools, right? And so, something that in research studies have been found is that there's generally 11 minutes of uninterrupted time before the next interruption for the average office worker. Okay. So and this interruption doesn't mean necessarily, someone coming right over, but maybe that email or the message or something that's incoming. And at the same time, in other studies, they've shown that it tends to take around 25 minutes for us to return to an original task after interruption. And so what this means is that we often end up in this loop where we're not ever getting to fully engage before we're experiencing an interruption. Okay. Another study that I think is really interesting, and I'll talk a little more about this piece, is a study where they had folks complete cognitive tasks that there were 3 different groups. One that was the uninterrupted groups. Also, I think my autocorrect was really having some creative times, so please ignore that. One group was uninterrupted, so they got to just do their cognitive tasks without any interruption. One was an interrupted group, so someone came in the midst of their tasks. And then the third group was a high alert group where they were told there was going to be an interruption, but were never actually interrupted. Okay. And so when they look at the cognitive performance of these folks compared against their norms that they collected, basically uninterrupted, no disruption, doing solid work. When folks are interrupted, their performance decreased 20%. And the folks who had the kind of threat of oncoming interruption was 20% or higher, basically loss of brain power, essentially. The things that I think are really interesting about this is that with practice interruption, which I think most of us are living now, we do get better at getting back to work more quickly, but with cost. And so often when this is the case, where we're maybe not getting back to work, we're cognitively less efficient, we're having more interruptions than we can sustainably create a working window, we often end up with higher stress, higher frustrations, heightened time pressure, or a heightened sense of falling behind, even when we're maybe not, because it's kind of feeds this like, oh, I can never get ahead of this thing. Okay. So with this, kind of as we're venturing into exploring digital tools and putting these things into action, part of this is that we want to know what's going on in your landscape already with tech and digital tools. And so your homework kind of on this week is to bring attention to your use of tech this week. How often do you absentmindedly check something? How much of your day-to-day work functions are created around the app versus what actually works for you? So that example I gave around maybe you check your email multiple times throughout a day and you end up getting, this is a personal story, where it's so easy for me to get sucked into responding to emails constantly in a way that compromises me being able to focus on the things that I needed and chose to focus on for the day. But because they're there, it's easy to check them. And so what are the ways that these kinds of patterns play out? Assessing and looking at how many places are you logging into professionally, personally, and of these, which is actually bringing joy, satisfaction, or goodness, which don't. I recognize also that if you're using an accounting software, it may not be bringing joy or satisfaction or goodness feelings. But we can also think of that as is this bringing ease, or is this making life better? Not necessarily I'm deeply satisfied doing this accounting app engagement. Unless you love accounting apps, and then good for you. Yes, that's great. So looking at when do you check the different tools and apps that you're using? Why do you check them when you check them? How do you decide on that? Is it intentional? Not. What impact does this have on your day? And how much uninterrupted work time are you getting? Right? And so we want to just be thinking about these pieces from this perspective of as we're looking at digital tools, even when they sound amazing, right? Okay, Slack can help us communicate more easily, or this tool that can help us sort of do project management in a more clear way, may be an excellent and awesome tool, but we also have to be really intentional about how am I engaging with this tool? And if I use this tool, what kind of engagement will it require for me to actually work well? And am I able to do that right now? Like, does that align with what I'm looking for? And this another kind of personal example. I've tried so many task apps and apps to keep track of tasks because they sound amazing and they have all these really great features. But if fundamentally my personal reality is that I'm going to struggle to remember to check the task list or to add things in that space, it could be the best app in the world and it's not actually going to be useful for me. Right. And so I need to know what are the things that actually do or don't work for me? What are the things that do or don't work for my team? Okay. Um, yeah. So takeaways here. Talked about these pieces. I don't think there's any chat comments. Let me just look at that. No. Okay, perfect. Then I'll talk through one more pitfall and then we'll have a chat for a minute. So another pitfall we're talking about in this same vein of broadly looking at, oh yeah, what are our relationships with the tools that we're using? And how are they going? And how can we actually ensure that the way that we're approaching all of the digital tools that are available with a critical mindset geared towards actually identifying and implementing the tools that are going to be best for us versus the alternative? Okay. So, pitfall number two, this happens all the time for both individuals and organizations, is that tools get enlisted to solve problems that they can't solve. So, for example, common scenario, an organization recognizes, hey, we have a communication problem. There are some things going awry. We're struggling with communication. And so someone is like, let's, also my cat's saying hello, let's use Slack. Slack helps with communication. It'll make it really easy for us to just ask the quick questions that'll make it work better. But perhaps the underlying communication isn't addressed and the old problem remains and now is just playing out through Slack. Okay. And so this happens a lot in all sorts of domains. And we think about it because if we think about a communication issue, it can be related to any number of these things and more, right? Are we having troubles with transmitting information? Are there gaps in the intent people are having when they're communicating versus the impact that's confusing? Is there a lack of clarity and transparency? Is information getting given to the wrong folks? Is it information overload? Do we have a lack of planning, overall vision, lack of feedback? Like, what is the thing that's actually happening? And if the thing is like, oh, we actually just do need tools to reach each other in a specific way, and Slack can solve that, then that may be a great tool and resource. But if that isn't the case, then we just now have Slack and the same problems now Slackified, right? And so when we think about tools, I always think about the fact that the best tools are those that align with the actual deeper needs of an organization or individual and are mindfully implemented with intentional expectations of iterative processing. Okay. So thinking through this, basically, the tool is a good tool when it actually meets the real needs, which means we actually have to understand the real needs, and we're implementing them knowing that we're going to have this iterative process unfold. Okay. A lot of times when people are looking at digital tools, they're wanting to address some of these common challenges: communication, tracking projects and work, workflow, visioning, scheduling, collaboration, etc. And there are a lot of apps that can and tools that can really be amazing in these areas. And we'll next week we'll look more broadly also at kind of the like big categories of tools that exist and some of the kind of key players in those domains, and getting a little bit more narrow on this and exploring more around how do we choose the best match. But there's lots of different needs, and digital tools might be a part of the solution, but we have to understand the problem first, right? And I think about this too. Simple tools can be amazing and fancy tools can be terrible, right? There isn't necessarily something that is better than the others if it is actually the thing that works, right? So we just want to be really clear about that as we're moving into engagement with the tools that we're using. Yeah. So with this, homework questions for you to ponder and sort of be thinking about. And some of these, right, you likely know kind of cognitively, like, oh yeah, what am I using? Well, I use Motion for scheduling and for task tracking and project management. It's like, I know that, but what are the ways, like, how am I actually using it on a daily basis? And what am I intending for this to answer or to address? Um, and I saw the chat in a second. I'll come right back to that. What problems do I intend for them to solve? Where is that working? Where is it falling short? Are there other problems that I or we are facing because of this? What tools am I using that I didn't pick? How are those working for me? Why? Yes, Jane, very much so. Yeah. And I think this is yes, exactly this too, where even not only is like the digital tool market going to continue expanding forever and ever, but yeah, if you're doing consulting work where you're working with one or multiple organizations at a time, you very likely are moving through all of these varying platforms, probably ones that you didn't necessarily pick and some that you may not actually particularly like very much, right? And so these are some of the things where it's like, no, I can't decide, am I intentionally implementing this tool with this group of people, unless you are actually doing that with the consulting work that you're doing. But what are the ways still that I'm looking critically, even if the organization isn't shifting or changing what they're doing? How can I also think about how am I intentionally, consciously engaging with whatever this tool is for my work that I'm doing with them. Um, yeah, totally. Yes, Kathleen, very much this. Yeah, and we're going to get into this is such a good question. And for folks that don't have the chat open, yeah, comment of that people often choose the tools because they have the buzz or because they're free. And how do we evaluate? Yeah, develop an evaluation period and a checklist. That's exactly it. And I think, and it makes it makes sense. I mean, when I go back to always kind of the psychological pieces of this and the components of this reality, very understandably that it's like, our brain, we tend to do groupthink, kind of jump on board with the thing that is the thing that sounds the coolest that everyone's using. And oh, all the organizations are using this thing. Okay, well, we should probably also use something like this. Or oh, everybody's using this type of whatever. Like, oh, I guess we should probably look at that for our organization. And maybe so, but also maybe not, depending. And I think this is exactly we'll talk a little bit about this today, Kathleen, but especially next week, we'll dive into this sort of like what is the exact kind of like timeline framework of if I'm considering it a tool, what are the questions that I need to be asking? And what is sort of the checklist of does this work for me? Does this not work for me? And we'll talk about this in a moment as well. But, as you all know, I mean, I've certainly experienced this as you've either learned the tools that you have to use through all of the organizations or have been trying to figure out what the best tool might be. It is really overwhelming to sort through all of the options, right? I'm like, okay, which one of these is actually the best one? And what's the difference between these different tools? And of course, everyone's own marketing is going to sell themselves as the ultimate, very best version of whatever it is. And I think this is why we'll look a little bit next week at, okay, how can we sort of weed out some of that information and narrow in on what we want? But also that as we start thinking really critically around, okay, what would it actually mean to use this tool? And how would that change what we're doing? And what are we actually doing right now? And where are the challenges we're facing? And beyond even just the simple challenge identification, what is that about? Like, what are the things causing that? Right? Because, okay, maybe we're having a task management problem that could be about all kinds of different things. And so we want to make sure that we're solving the right problems with the tools that we're using, or else we just actually end up creating other problems, or the old problem still exists, but just has the flavor and is manifesting through whatever this tool is. And so I think you're totally right, is that a lot of people throw on a random thing because it sounds really good. Like, who doesn't want productivity and good communication and project tracking? Like, I certainly do. And if there's any tool I could download that actually just magically made that happen, I certainly would. Right. But it goes a lot deeper than that. Yeah, let me read. Yes, totally, Jane. Absolutely. Yes. Yes, very much. Yes, the computer differences of Mac platform and Microsoft, and that there's sometimes like crossover versions that kind of work on one or the other, but that really aren't that great. And so, yeah, absolutely looking at, yeah, who needs to be able to actually use and access this, and what is going to actually work for me and us, right? Because a lot of times I think we implement tools. I mean, I'm guilty of this myself, that are kind of aspirational tools, like it's like, oh, yes, we will use this, or I will use this, and it will create all the things that it promises it's going to create, or it has that buzz with it. But then how is that actually going? Because whether or not it works is dependent on me and on us actually being able to successfully engage with that, which means we need to actually be able to do that. And it has to actually fundamentally work for us, right? On both a logistics level of what browser you're using, what kind of computer you're using, but also within the processes that we have. Often, I mean, there can be times, of course, that an organization maybe needs a giant overhaul, but often we're looking to sort of clean or shape or shift things and are not necessarily wiping out every practice we've ever had. And if you expect that to happen with the integration of a new tool, then there's a lot of space moving from one place to another within that. Yeah, let me look at. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that folks are updating systems to access grant application forms more easily. Yes. And yes, there are certain types of things that it's like, yes, please do these things. Absolutely. Cool. Awesome. I'll keep chatting at you a bit, but feel free, comment, chat anytime, and we'll keep rolling through some of these. Something else kind of in this realm, and I'll note too, I'm talking a lot about here sort of like, okay, apps that are already going, tools that are already going, and some of the ways that has is problematic or can create limitations or problems. But as you all have been doing in the chat box, when we're looking at these things, part of that is understanding, oh yeah, how did it get here? And what information does that give me about how I want to move forward with this? And how do I and we actually create sustainable digital practices that do evolve and shift, because there will constantly be evolution in what is happening in the digital landscape, while also like being rooted in systems that are evolving and hopefully working. So yes. Okay. Pitfall number 3. Something, and I've talked a little bit about this already, but I have talked about this specific slide I've talked about a lot, right? Is that a lot of tools are implemented without us understanding fully the problem that they're intending to fix, without necessarily thinking through how that tool will or won't solve the problems, without necessarily an initiation guide to move through that implementation phase, without systems in place for reviewing and evaluating the use of tools, and kind of the systems for optimizing them. And so part of what we'll do in this series is look at, okay, when it comes to selecting tools, what are the things we need to be evaluating, thinking about? How can we do that critically in a way that sets ourselves up for success? And once tools are in place, how can we iteratively continue to optimize the benefit from the tools and to shift and change the things sorry, I was reading the chat and I'll come back to that in a second, that change kind of as we go. Yes, let me look at. Yes, Lynn, very much this pieces. Yes, definitely. It's exactly like designing a building without understanding how you operate. Very, very, very much. And it is, I mean, it's one of those things that's it's not even like, oh, we're just all failing doing these things. It's like the systems are complex. Folks are not always the folks creating these tools, resources, platforms are not always super clear with how things are going to work. And then, yeah, we can have exactly these added layers and shifts that unfold. And yes, we probably won't today get into all of the proprietary system subscription cost pieces like in a specific way, but very much, yes, that's a part of this larger puzzle and conversation. And yes, I think very much kind of your capitalizing on this piece of like, yeah, the problem with template culture. And I think, and this gets slightly kind of tangential, but I think the thing that we see happening with digital tools and the digital landscape is a lot of the same stuff and things, like the problems in organizations overall, just now sort of like transposed into the digital realm and world, right? So if we look at a lot of the challenges that organizations face and that individuals face, a lot of these pieces are kind of rooted in this, like, we get on autopilot and just do the things that we've been taught to do. We're taught to, default to the template culture, to the things that exist, to the things that go, oh yeah, that sounds good, but without the time to kind of critically unpack or to explore or to build the relationships and communication capabilities together that we need to actually problem solve and understand the challenges that we have, right? I can't count how many times I've been into giant corporation settings who talk about like, well, we have a communication problem. We want to fix this. And that's definitely something I can help with, but it requires people actually being willing to pull apart and seek curiosity and understanding about what the problem is. And there isn't a set of checklists exactly of, oh, just perform this one thing and then your communication is perfect, because we are ultimately a complex human being. That organizations are sort of a complex web of exchange all the time. And so part of this is looking at, okay, how do we capitalize on the tools that exist? And are there templates or parts of templates that we can certainly use from so we don't reinvent the wheel every time? But also, how do we make sure that we're taking the time to really assess and look at the way that these interactions are happening and impacting our lives and vice versa, and ways that we can do that intentionally? Yes. So exactly, often what will happen is, in kind of consideration, and I invite you to think about these things through the week, is that we'll notice sometimes our workflow is shifting in response to whatever the tool is that we're using, rather than, oh, we're using this tool and we want to pick how we're going to use that based on what works best for us. And this is even the simplest version is like that email example I gave earlier. Email is amazing for communication. And also, when I'm existing in a place where every time I think about my email or I see a little thing pop up notifying me, I go over to it, I'm suddenly really losing my ability to focus. And I'm a person who really loses focus quite easily. And so it's really natural that if I respond to the emails need every time something pops up, I go there. That's not actually serving me in the way that I want it to, versus if I recognize, okay, I'm going to have set times where I'm checking this. It creates a container and is very useful without some of the compromise. That's a very simple example. Obviously, it gets more complex when we're talking about more multi-layered and nuanced tools. Something else that I think is really interesting kind of in this communication realm, and I see this a lot in organizations and challenges that are being faced by folks, is this sort of, it's so easy with messaging apps and, with Teams and Slack and whatever, there to just drop a line to someone else about like, oh, I'm stuck, what about this thing? Or hey, do you think this, or whatever, which it can be amazing if you do just need to reach someone and get a piece of information. But I find that it also really shifts our feeling of obligation if I have to be checking into this all the time, which then replicates that like anticipated interruption brain phase. And this is potentially even more true if you're doing consulting and have to check 8 different apps and services to sort of see, oh yeah, who's sent me something. But I think it also means that there are times that folks are reaching out and sending that message because it feels so easy, when maybe they actually don't need to do that, right? In a moment longer of pondering it, they would have reached their conclusion or reached their solution. But instead now there's been this message sent because it's easy, right? And so we want to be thinking about, how are we using the tools that we're using? When are they working? When are they not? Right. And so as we get into sort of this model of figuring out, okay, yeah, what is the checklist of things that we want to look at when considering an application or a tool? Then beyond that, how are we really engaging this iterative process, right? Are we doing the initial planning, the wondering, the ideating, then the actual planning, evaluating the requirements that we have? We're, I mean, this exact example was created around like iterative design, so it says design there, but similarly, the analysis and design of how we will use whatever this is, the implementation, we see how it goes, we evaluate how it's going, and then we repeat that until potentially things are landed where they are. Although I'd argue that to some degree there will always continue to be and should be this process unfolding, and that we never fully get to just kind of put that um, question mark. And I'm reading that. Yes, very much, Kayla. Yes, exactly this too. That I think the cost of sort of all of the switching and the utilization of different tools isn't the cost is very much there without it necessarily being fully recognized or acknowledged in a way that it's like, oh, it feels kind of weird to bill for longer than this because the actual answering of the question wasn't so long, took a couple minutes, but that there is this cost to these shifts, these going to that space, to showing up, to bringing our mental energy to a space completely. Yes, um, absolutely. So, a couple more homework questions. Thinking about listing out the tools that you're using, thinking about how does the tool impact the nature of your work. So, not necessarily like, oh, this tool I use to send a message, but how is it shaping the actual like quality and like oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the word, like the components of the ways you're exchanging information, right? So it's like, yes, I can send messages easily via Slack and that can be great, but how is it actually changing our working relationship to use this tool or that tool? How does it shape the way that we collaborate, that we work together? What does that look like? um, and then I invite you also to think about how your own communication style has changed with the implementation of various tools over time that you use or have used, etc. And especially noticing, are there tools that you really like or really dislike? Are there things that maybe fall into that personal risk factor domain? Um, this could be a lot of different things. For me, it's definitely, if I open the app, it's really easy for me to get lost in that because I am just like, oh, let me respond to this, let me respond to this, let me respond to this. And so I lose track of my own kind of time guarding can be a challenge. And I think sometimes as well, because I tend to answer questions efficiently, that also means I tend to get a lot of answers back, which then can create more, sometimes work there. In a way that doesn't necessarily match the actual need. Um, yeah. Are there tools that you're using that feel unaligned with your own practices as a person, but are perhaps required by the organization, etc.? And just noticing what you notice about that. And it falls into this category of like, we often know a lot about how are we using tools, where are we running into challenges, right? Because you maybe repeatedly are just like, oh, I hate this thing about this tool that we use. But we want to really understand what these things are, because when we're evaluating a potential future tool, we're not only just looking at the logistics of, can this do the schedule thing I need it to do, but we also want to be running it through our mind of, okay, me knowing how I work and what works best for me, and an understanding how this tool works. Is this actually aligned? Would, in order to use this tool successfully, I need to change something about my general rhythms and practice as a person? And is that doable, a good idea, unnecessary, etc.? Okay. So other pitfalls, I'm going to run through some of these and then we'll have a moment of chatting here at the end because I know the hours go really quickly. So last few pitfalls, digital overwhelm analysis paralysis. I've certainly been here, and you probably also have been here, where you're trying to evaluate and think through the billion of different tools that are maybe an option and figuring out like, okay, which one of these works best? And okay, this one costs that much, but what about the team pieces? Do they integrate with these other things? Like, how do I just make sense of this? I definitely sometimes have that instinct of like, I just want to get rid of everything that I'm doing and start over, because it seems like it's simpler, although it wouldn't actually necessarily be, right? But kind of keeping a mind on this. Similarly, sunk cost fallacy. Often we've been using an app, a tool, and because we've been using it and are like, well, I put so much energy and time into setting this up, like I should just find a way to make this work, versus, okay, maybe this isn't actually working for me. And what do I need to look at or what do I need to evaluate? Yeah, let me look at this chat. Yeah. Mhm. Totally. Yeah, I totally get this, Jane. Yes. Yeah, the difficulty of working with certain tools teams. I share a similar judgment about teams. Yeah, and then it can just be really difficult and that it can make it really challenging, right? And sometimes there are these navigation pieces that when certain times, of course, you can't do anything about it because the whole organization and system is very integrated in whatever the system is that they're using. Um, but it definitely means that this is a piece kind of on the table in a reality of, oh yeah, how does this impact the work that we are doing together, and where are there difficulties and challenges within that, and how is this challenge going to impact uh, the work that I'm doing with you, etc., and what does that mean, what does that look like? um, yes, very very much. And so I think these are exactly, you all have made such nice kind of thoughtful comments, and these are kind of the, like, I think highlights some of the exactly this big picture piece that through these trainings, in addition to kind of concrete skills and lay of the land stuff, that there's this piece of like, yeah, what do we do with this reality of so many tools? We're using tons of them. How do we wade through these things? Different teams using different tools. How do I navigate this? And also keep as much of possible my own sort of sanity and groundedness in me being able to do the work that I do in some of the ways that are aligned with like my own work rhythm versus just feeling pulled in all of the directions, while also knowing that we maybe are pulled in lots of different directions, right? Um, yes, that consultant, Kathy, we're going to talk more about that in one of the future trainings for sure. Yeah, how can a consultant avoid having to learn a ton of new tools that the organization's chosen? Definitely, we're going to talk about this. And some of it's naturally going to depend on what kind of consultation you're doing, and what your work looks like, because there may be times where it does or doesn't, uh, is or isn't as easy in certain ways. But I think that there definitely are ways to not just have to all the time dive fully into those tools, because sometimes it is really counterproductive. And I think the same way that an organization implementing a tool without like the sort of mindfulness around it can lead to sort of things being disjointed. If also you're suddenly having to be proficient in 15 different tools for all of these different organizations, like that just isn't fully realistic, right? Like, I mean, maybe if you spend a ton of time learning all of the tools very thoroughly, or maybe you're just technologically inclined, like I could likely figure out how to use most tools fairly easily. But also, am I really going to be able to use those tools to like leverage the work that I'm doing very quickly? Probably not, but maybe, depending on how many it is, what type of tool, etc. And so I think very much we have to hold this reality of, okay, how do we navigate that organizations are using lots of tools, and recognizing I'm not necessarily going to become proficient fully in all of these, but how do we still do the work that we're doing? And how can we help the organization think through the tools that they're using, the ways that I'm engaging with them that may or may not be included within that system, et cetera. So we'll definitely unpack those pieces further. And naturally, it's going to vary by person. So, but yes, that is very much on the table. Yes. So a couple others, I mostly talked about these. Lack of intentional implementation. I will note though that it is never too late. So if an organization is using a tool, but there's a lot of missing unsolved problems, it's never too late to figure out and to implement structures that make that tool more useful. And I think even when you're consulting and maybe you are using or have to use or sort of exist within a tool because that's the thing the organization is using, we'll talk about ways that you can kind of critically ask and inquire about, like, okay, this is what I'm wanting to achieve here, and I'm feeling like this is difficult within the context of this tool, or to help me understand the way that we can make this happen best within this tool, etc. It's going to vary a lot depending on what you're doing. Yeah. But more to come. So we've got 1 minute left. So I know it's going really quickly. And last piece, thinking about we want to make sure that when we're using tools, that we're creating that bridge from our current reality and the ways and the processes that we currently have to whatever our new ideas are. This is also true if there's a tool already in action, looking at, okay, how are we using this right now? What do we want to change in having this work better using different tools, et cetera? And how do we close that gap? How do we actually create the pathway? And I think some of this does pertain to this question that you asked about, like, okay, I haven't chosen this tool, but I'm now using it. How can we either individually kind of find that bridge from the thing that I would normally do into this space where this specific tool exists, or what are the ways that we want to shift how we're doing this? Okay, so I know this has gone super quickly. There's so much information here, but I think very much y'all are thinking about these concepts, right? And this is what I want to be happening, is looking at not only, okay, what is the tool, but how can we critically engage with these deeper layers, these deeper pieces around, like, oh yeah, how is this getting used right now? And even if you are using tools that you didn't pick, that you're having to kind of toggle for the different organizations you're working with, still looking for yourself. Maybe you still have to use all of those tools, but looking for yourself at, like, okay, how am I using these tools? When am I using these tools? How much space are these taking? In what ways am I interacting and engaging with this content, these tools, people this way, etc.? And so, yes, we will continue this conversation in next week. We'll start looking kind of at the overall lay of the land. We'll start looking at kind of the checklist of, if you're considering a tool, what should you be going through? And a lot of these things apply to tools that you're also already using. So even if you're like, I've got tools up the wazoo, I do not need more tools, a lot of the things that will be able to apply differently. And yes, totally, Jane, very much. Yeah, the generational differences for sure. Mhm. Yeah, which I think also, and I know if folks need to log off, I totally understand. I think too, it makes me think about the differences also of generationally the role that tech has even played in lives, right? Like the young folks, it's like tech's just been inherently part of the deal kind of forever, versus for other folks, it has not been, and how that changes kind of the intention and awareness of what that entering into our own life, the workplace kind of did or didn't do, etc. Yes, so lots more to come. Good to be with all of you. Thank you so much for joining and sharing your thoughts, and hope to see you again next week for more diving in, and we will see all of you soon. Have a great rest of your
Thank you, Lacey. We'll see you next
day.
week. À la semaine prochaine. Bye.